Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's Level 3 Business Administrator Refresher webinar. My name is Don Green. Before we start, can somebody please just type into the chat function that you can hear me clearly, please? Thank you. And of course, if you can you see my screen as well, which should be a holding page? Thank you. Excellent. Thank you very much. That's much appreciated. So, good afternoon, and hopefully, wherever you are in the country, you are getting better weather than I am in Yorkshire. It is bouncing down here at home, so please do apologise if you can hear it on my flat roof. So, without further ado, what I want to do today is have a bit of a recap on our previous webinar, and which looked at the new version 2 Business Administrator 9473 assessment plan, known as AP03. Now, this webinar is being recorded. Please don't feel as if you have to scroll down lots of notes today. You will get a copy of the webinar within 24 hours, which should be sent to you. And you will also be able to download a copy of the slides from our webpage under the previous webinar recording and archive webinars section, which can be found under the qualifications section and then business skills. During the webinar, if you do have any questions, we can address them at the end if we've got time. Fear not if we can't address them for whatever reason, or we run out of time. What I'll do is I will create the usual frequently asked questions document, and we will also post that up onto our website alongside the recording and a copy of the slide deck. So, first of all, we're going to have a bit of a recap on the new assessment plan, or not so new assessment plan actually. Look at the mapping of assessment methods. The lead IEPAs have kindly given some areas of concern which we can address. And Laura Dean is our new digital solutions manager, who is hopefully, technology allowing, going to give us a quick look at where the documents sit on EPA Pro for the exemplar. However, she is struggling to get in at the moment. So fingers crossed, she can join us. Okay, so as the new assessment plan is AP03, then just need to recap. Whenever you are looking at an assessment plan, please do look in the top right-hand corner, as I've screenshot there in the highlighted with the red arrow in the top right-hand corner of this screen. Actually, the highlighted area, it does say ST0070/AP03. You will know then if you're working from the correct assessment plan. So AP03 then is not a generic assessment plan that applies to all. It only impacts those learners who started their apprenticeship from the 10th of September 2020. So we're now, 14 months, 15 months in to AP03, but that's not obviously going to be followed by everybody just at the moment, because we will still have some learners that were registered with an ILR start date of 9th of September and earlier 2020. So when you are registering anybody on the new AP03, you need to make sure that you do use the City and Guilds registration number 9473-22. If you still haven't registered any on version 1, then that would have been 9473-12, but we expect everybody who is on that version to have registered already, as you are 14, 15 months in already. So there are City and Guilds EPA packs for both assessment plans, so please be making sure that you are downloading the correct assessment pack depending on which version you're using. They are available on both EPO and the City and Guilds website. And now that we are 15 months in, we are seeing endpoint assessments coming through already on AP03. So learners are already being assessed on AP03. Okay, so As it also says there, if you do have any special considerations for any of your apprentices, please do click on the link. The link will work on the PDF version of this slide deck, which can be found on the website itself. So let's do a bit of a recap then on the different assessment methods. So nothing's changed at all regarding the three assessment methods, and basically they consist of the online multiple choice test, the project-based presentation, and the portfolio-based interviews, and those are the three key components. Now, due to time constraints, we can't sadly go into each one in a lot of detail. So if you click on the link at the bottom of that page, then that will take you to all the recorded webinars that we've done previously back in January, March and May, which do go into a little bit more detail. So those should support. So in terms of practicalities then, the current knowledge test is wherever possible really completed first. And this will remain the same as well with version 1 and version 2. So with version 1 then, the standard, what we'd normally do is conduct the portfolio-based interview first after the multiple choice test, then followed by the project improvement presentation and Q&A. Now, the current standard dictates that the portfolio-based interview and project improvement presentation are marked individually. So this means any evidence obtained in one assessment can't be used to support any of the marks in the follow-up assessment. So essentially the portfolio and the project. So that's how the version 1 assessment plan will run. The new process on version 2, slightly different. So here you can see how the amended EPA process will usually look. The knowledge test should be conducted first, as with the first version, but we have changed the recommended order of assessment. So the project presentation is next, followed by a 30-minute break, and then the interview of that portfolio. That'll be last. So this is quite a big change for everyone, and I'm sure at this stage you are questioning why are we changing it round. Well, the short answer really is that there is likely to be, it is likely to be in the best interests of the apprentice. Essentially, one of the positives of the new standard is that it now allows for some, albeit limited, some holistic marking across both areas of the EPA event, which didn't really lend itself to holistic marking previously. So it makes logical sense that for the presentation to be delivered first, as we can mark information given to us during that presentation, then ask questions, rather than ask questions for which the answer may then be given in the presentation. So we're kind of holistically marking, hence here the 30-minute break. So the upshot is the project and the interview are still separate assessments, but it is important really to be clear on that. The project interview is the interview, they're not combined in any way. But we're fortunate now with some changes that we can use some of the limited evidence to cross-reference and mark some of the evidence from the project to the portfolio. So that's the reason really for the increase to the 30 minutes for the break time, as it allows apprentices, a suitable time for a comfort break and prepare for the interview, as well as giving the IEPA time to prepare or amend any further questions following what they've heard in the presentation. And to look at what areas can be personalised really to support the apprentice most effectively. So if they haven't specifically covered anything, that 30-minute break will allow an opportunity for the IEPA to try and allow them time to delve a little bit deeper there. Now, the mapping, the project presentation and the portfolio interview are now weighted the same. Well, they were actually before, but the weightings have changed a little bit. So previously, it was 20% for the knowledge test, and it was 40% for the project and 40% for the portfolio. What's changed is now the knowledge test is 33.3%, the project is 33.3%, as is the portfolio. Now, because the portfolio and the project are weighted the same, therefore it's reasonable to assume that, this is quite confusing actually, that approximately 50% of the KSBs linked to either of the assessment would be in the portfolio, and 50% of the KSBs would be in the project. It's not reasonable to assume, nor really is it fair on the apprentice to expect all the KSBs to be mapped into or rolled into one of the assessment because of that weighting. Otherwise, it kind of moves away from that 50% of the KSBs being directly split down the middle. If that was the case, then really the assessment method that would not carry the same weighting. So where the KSBs, where the competencies are mapped into a single assessment method, if it says, for instance, that it must be achieved in the portfolio, then that's obviously the case. However, where the KSBs or competencies are mapped into either or on the assessment plan, approximately 50% of the KSBs linked to either assessment must be achieved in each. So in the event where some KSBs have not been sufficiently demonstrated during that project improvement presentation, during that EPA, these may be assessed as part of the portfolio-based interview, and that's where this holistic approach comes in, and that's where that 30-minute break comes in to try and really look at what's been assessed already and what hasn't, which is not an easy task for the IEPAs, to be fair. So the 30-minute break allows the apprentice to just have a comfort break and have a think about where they're up to, and also for the IEPA to look at what they've already assessed. Now, already you should really be aware of the mapping of the assessment criteria document, which is shown on screen, and it sits in the annex of the centre pack. But I just want to revisit it really to emphasise how vital this document is for you and your apprentices, really as they prepare for endpoint assessment. There is a concern that the new Epa 03 really is the change that each learner must achieve 100% of the pass components and 100% of the distinction components in order to achieve a distinction overall. It's the same for every awarding organisation. Every EPAO out there must adhere to that, because you know, that's what the assessment plan states. That's what the IFAT has the decision that they've been made. So every EPAO must adhere to that. But the changes in how the assessment criteria covered, where I mentioned previously about some of the holistic assessment, that actually could make it easier to achieve. The assessment plan talks about how the 50% of the criteria now need to be covered within each assessment method. With this mapping document, we've done that for you. So we've divided the competencies into where they fall most naturally. So as a result, the number of competencies in each method has been reduced so that the apprentice can focus really on covering what needs to be demonstrated in the interview and in their project presentation. So by looking at this mapping assessment criteria doc, you can see where we think it fits best, so where we think the evidence would be placed as far as the apprentice is concerned. So along with the EPA assessment pack, this really is your fundamental go-to resource. It's for all centres, it's for all training providers, as well as employers and apprentices to look at. And we'd really suggest that it's thoroughly studied to make sure that everybody gets the most out of it. Essentially, a dog-eared copy in every folder will be fantastic, with lots of highlights and marking pens and good old-fashioned post-it notes on it. Now, the lead IEPAs have been very kind in providing feedback. So what we're going to look at now is the project improvement presentation, followed by the portfolio, what makes a distinction apprentice, areas to be aware of before the resources. And it does look like, unfortunately, Laura is still struggling to get in, so we may not be able to show you on EPA Pro where the resources are. However, we'll address that when we come to it. So I just want to clarify the process, really, of the new project presentation for you. The project is now submitted to us at Gateway because there is now a presentation question associated to the project report. So the project report is a 2,000 to 5,000 word document. It's submitted to us at Gateway. The IEPA will then look at the project report and then issue you with a question, which via email, so we'll go to the training provider or the centre, in which the apprentice must answer within the presentation slide deck. That question could be something like, how have you improved the process or operating practice? It could be, what were the steps you took to implement the project? What worked well? How would you improve, etc. The question will be specific to the project. So for me, the probability is, if there are weak areas of that project report within that 2,000 to 5,000 words, the likelihood is the IEPA may well think, right, in order to provide further evidence to confirm competence, knowledge, skills, behaviours, etc., it might be then that the question would be related to a specific weakness, if there is any, within that project report. So it might be then that the learner answers that question throughout the whole project slides. It might be that the learner dedicates 1 or 2 slides to answering the specific question. Either way, the learner would still follow the guidance in the handbook in order to ensure they've covered everything that's required within the slide deck itself. So as far as timescale is concerned, 8 days from Gateway being passed, so having submitted your functional skills or GCSE evidence, having submitted the tri-party agreement document, so where the apprentice has signed, the centre signed and the employer signed, you will then get confirmation that you've successfully gone through Gateway. Then the IEPA will be allocated and we'll look and review the 2,000 to 5,000 word document, the report, then we'll issue that question. So 8 days from Gateway having been passed, that's when the question will be issued, and it will be at the moment via email. How should that question be addressed? Well, I've just mentioned really that the final presentation wouldn't be submitted until that question's been answered. So that presentation wouldn't actually be submitted until 2 weeks prior to endpoint assessment happens. So really, once the report's been submitted, the time then between the report being submitted, getting the question, and the EPA being sat, that's the time there where the learner has to answer that question and pop it into the slide deck. So the presentation must include still the KSBs listed in the assessment plan, like I mentioned. So things like the aim, the outcome, the responsibilities involved, how the tasks are approached, etc. And then up to the learner again, but the answer to the question posed must be incorporated into the presentation. It might be that they dedicate a single slide to it, or they're just essentially adding it into the whole of the slide deck. Because the slide deck is 15 minutes long, we wouldn't expect to see normally lots and lots of slides. The apprentice will need to make sure that they've addressed all the KSBs, but also that they've practiced that presentation to make sure that they do finish on time. 15 minutes is very strict. The IEPAs will stop the learner after 15 minutes, otherwise they are giving an unfair advantage to someone who's got further time. So generally, what happens is that if the learner is struggling or running out of time, the IEPA will ask them to move forward to summarise their presentation as the 15 minutes is running out. So the project report, this is what's submitted to us at Gateway, or in order to generate that question. And in order for us to set that relevant question, that report would be around the bullet points there. So scoping, planning, managing, how they've communicated to stakeholders, the monitoring and reporting aspects, and then the reflective side. What would you do differently? How could the project be improved? Sorry. moving forward if it was to be done again. Now, there is a template attached to the centre documents. It doesn't have to be used. In the pack, there is essentially an A4 piece of paper with each of the headings on: scoping, planning, managing, etc. Some like to use this template. Some like to write it more in their own words in a report format. Again, that is entirely up to you. It doesn't have to be used, but as long as the content that's bullet pointed there is included, that's absolutely fine. So it's not actually a requirement, just to stress then, that the final presentation be submitted to us 2 weeks prior. The portfolio needs to be submitted, but it's not actually a requirement that that presentation is submitted. However, for good practice, what I would say is that it is submitted. It only takes technology or a dropout in internet or something like that to happen on the day, an issue happen on the day, and suddenly the learner then is struggling to find the slides, to move forward, to share screen, etc. If the IEPA does have a copy of the slide deck, then they might be able to sort something out on the day, and at least the IEPA has got sight of them. But like I said, there is no requirement whatsoever to upload the presentation if they don't want at all. However, if you do, we're more than happy and we'd strongly recommend that you do. So what makes a distinction grade apprentice? So having looked at what success generally looks like, let's really look at now what pushes that apprentice into distinction grade. And first, the portfolio-based interview. So there's 3 concepts, and the 3 concepts really are listed there: consistency, being proactive, being responsive. So with regard to consistency, features in many of the KSPs, for example, in IT, for instance, communications, quality, those need to be consistently addressed. So how can that be demonstrated? So good examples, confidently spoken about, references to positive feedback over time. They all allow for evidence to be generated around consistency. Being proactive. So a distinction apprentice will generally take it upon themselves to develop their own skills, that they will, say, offer their own coaching. They'll influence and challenge peers proactively and on their own. They'll come up with good ideas. They'll promote good practice themselves. Specifically in regulations and policies, for instance, always good to be proactive there. They'll act as a role model, for instance, to colleagues, maybe as an ambassador on behalf of the organisation. So any evidence that they can generate around that always links to those distinction criteria. It basically requires employers to trust them as an apprentice in positions of responsibility, but it's also really the apprentice who needs to show they can be trusted to take these on. And once they can be trusted, that then allows them to be proactive off their own back. Being responsive then, a distinction apprentice will be self-motivated. They'll respond to feedback. They'll continually assess their own work, for example. They'll show integrity in owning up to any mistakes. They'll generally evaluate the impact of any changes and use that evaluation to improve their own performance. So basically, it's down to the apprentice rather than anything the employer is responsible for, but it's something that should be highlighted for an aspiring apprentice to understand. So it's about the apprentice being responsive off their own back. Moving on to the project presentation and the question and answer session. So the choice of the project really here is the key, be it for pass or distinction. Unless the apprentice has had a say in that project, they really can't get passionate about it. But for a distinction, it needs to be a significant project. A bit of a vague, subjective term until you look at the other distinction criteria, really. But a significant project will be substantial, it'll be complex, it'll involve interaction with a range of different stakeholders, for example, and it'll allow the apprentice really to show strong leadership skills and really demonstrate them throughout. So, I mean, sorting out the stockroom, for instance, is a valid project and one which could easily be achieved as a pass, but it quite possibly won't lend itself really. It will allow the apprentice to demonstrate the skills in sufficient depth and breadth to gain a distinction. So that choice of project will very much depend on the employer and how much responsibility they're prepared to give to the actual apprentice. So their full engagement in this process and an understanding of what's needed really is vital so that they can support the apprentice accordingly. That project should not be initiated, remember, until month 9 of the apprenticeship. That's what it says in the assessment plan, and that's what we must stick to. It's not to stop, of course, early discussions about what would be suitable, what potential issues, what could be improved prior to month 9. You know, you can have those conversations with line managers, with the apprentice and yourself and the line manager to try and get a head start, to think of what could be used as a project moving forward after on month 9 and onwards. But remember then, it's a fine line between having a challenging project, a high level project, and it being too big, remembering that the project itself is only 21 to 35 working hours long. Now, there's nothing to say that they need to audit that, to check, to log the hours, but generally it should be between 21 and 35 working hours long, which in the grand scheme of things is a 7-day working week, 35 hours. And of course, a learner is not going to fulfill the project in 1 week. It might be that the learner will do an hour here, 2 hours in the next week, 3 hours in the next week after, none in the week after, because they might be waiting for research to come back in the form of questionnaires, for example, or stakeholder responses, etc. So it is going to take longer than that 35-hour working week, but think of it as a working week in total. So it's not masses, it's not a massive project in itself. An apprentice may well have a role in a wider company initiative, and it's not a problem in itself, but they must be able to show what their individual responsibility is here in that wider initiative and what decisions they took and why. A big red flag really to an assessor is a constant reference to we did this and the team did that in the presentation or the report. And it's often leading to the question really from an IEPA's point of view, well, what did you actually do in this project? And that's the key. It's very difficult for an apprentice, or for us actually as individuals, we find it very difficult to sell ourselves, to say how good we are. We're very good at saying what part we played in a team and how well the team did, etc. But this really is a time to shine for the learner, for the apprentice, to sell themselves to the IEPA and say, I did this, look at the evidence, I'm really good here, and this is the proof that I'm really good. And the learner is selling themselves somewhat and backing up what they're saying with that project report and with that presentation evidence. Decision making then and project management are both knowledge, skills and behaviour areas which are exclusive to just the project improvement presentation assessment method. So they don't come into the portfolio. So it cannot be explored further in that portfolio-based interview. So this is a piece of evidence here that cannot be holistically assessed. If it's not done in the project, it can't be assessed in that portfolio. So you need to be mindful there of that document that I showed previously, the mapping criteria content document, that where it's and the assessment plan, where it's singular, where KSBs are assessed in only the portfolio or only the project, that's exactly what happens. They can't be holistically assessed. So a distinction-seeking apprentice really needs to show how strong their leadership skills are. For instance, how they have to be in charge, for instance, in order to get that leadership skills, they need to actively plan the different stages of the project. It is their project, so there's no reason why they can't fulfill the leadership side of things here. Yes, they are an apprentice, and yes, they will have line managers, but because it's their project and they're taking responsibility for it, they should show evidence of strong leadership skills there. And it might even be that actually they might even possibly manage a small team. It might not be the case, but that doesn't matter if it's not. So in the planning, they'll demonstrate they have a strong grasp of the project management tools. Now, there's a plural there, project management tools, so make sure that you are looking into at least a couple of management tools there. All of these criteria are in the assessment plan and the mapping doc, so maybe well, essentially it's really good practice for you to explore and discuss with the apprentice and their employer, actually, you know, what it does say in there, and highlight the key areas that they will need to address within that project. And that's probably something that should be addressed prior to the project starting, to make sure that there is scope within that project to actually achieve. So moving on then to an example of pass and distinction apprentice then. For a pass, the apprentice needs to show that the distinctions made during that project are thought through using a range of information to make a sound judgment, P1. For the related distinction then, they need to show that decisions are continuously made by thoughtfully considering different information. So to gain a pass, the presentation should show that the apprentices have to make decisions, which is understandable. Those decisions have been made independently and why they've made them. So what was the basis for those decisions? And for a distinction then, they'd have to be making more decisions necessitated by that project being significant or more complex. And the decisions there are therefore based on the wider range of information, perhaps responding to changing circumstances or something like that. So while making those decisions, they need to consider any risks that might be involved, for instance, or what could be done to overcome them. And that then links to the complex criteria, where all parts of it must be evidenced. So, for instance, the decisions, the range of information, and the risks that are involved there. So areas to be aware of then. Hopefully these examples here and explanations can guide you really to support the learner onwards. So these are extracts then of the mapping document that we mentioned and how it works in practical terms. And you'll see how the color coding helps you really determine how a criteria is expected to be assessed. So starting off with IT then, you have, it's an area really where apprentices will naturally show competence in both the project and the portfolio-based interview. So what's the tricky corner then? What's the area to be aware of? We're using IT to analyse information then. Most apprentices analyse information on a daily basis, but they need to talk about this in one or the other assessment. It could be in analysing information to support decisions in the project, or it could be part of their daily job in the portfolio. Now, as far as D1 and D2 are concerned, what we've actually said is we think it links best to the portfolio-based interview only. So if you can evidence the Ds in the portfolio, so the need for consistency and the need to demonstrate coaching skills, then we think those will be demonstrated best portfolio and not the project in this instance. So interpersonal skills there, working with a range of people is going to come out naturally across both assessments. We expect challenge and influence to be evidenced within the project, as new ideas or processes will really often lead to influencing and having to challenge peers and managers there. It's an area common to both assessment methods, so follow-up questions by the assessor may come within either the project or that interview around the portfolio as well. But the important thing is that the apprentice has evidenced the challenging peers section, so the apprentice must evidence that. And managers for distinction as well, so influence managers as well there. So for D1, and if they say we're a great team and we've never had any problems, clearly that's not going to lend itself to the distinction criteria. So the challenge aspect then doesn't necessarily have to be about actual conflict, for instance. It could be about reminding a colleague about a new process. That could be a challenge in itself. It could be about having to discuss something with a manager that they don't necessarily feel confident about. but they do stick to the guns and they challenge what's being said, obviously politely in a professional manner. Conflicts and challenges always happen in the workplace, but it's about really evidencing that and knowing when it's happened. So it's often the case then that the apprentice can't think of anything when put on the spot during endpoint assessment, but if they're well prepared, they will have already thought about that prior to endpoint assessment and will have it, written down or in the back of their mind, so they should be able to come up with some good examples there. So that's all about the prep really prior to it. Now, like we mentioned previously, within decision making, this area is only tested in the project improvement presentation. There's also criteria about challenging appropriately and being polite when doing so as well, so be aware of that as well. Now, communications, another area tested in both the project improvement presentation and the portfolio-based interview. Most of the criteria will be easily evidenced, but the distinction in communications, we will expect to see that in the portfolio, or we think that it will be easiest to evidence in that in the portfolio-based interview. It is something apprentices struggle with, so it's important really to understand the term championing, which is about encouraging others to use innovative communication methods. So it might be social media, Teams or Zoom, or basically thinking outside the box to get messages across, really. So it's worth noting really that if the whole project is about championing a new method of communication, this would quite probably not be asked about in the portfolio-based interview because of that holistic assessment. So that's one positive of AP03. It's certainly lending itself to that holistic approach. Planning and organisational skills are really important and fundamental really to success in a business administrator role, and there's definitely some areas of concern here or tricky corners. At pass level, apprentices have to manage resources and they need to manage and organise meetings. If they don't, they just won't pass. So conversations with employers are important here really to ensure that they've the right opportunities. And of course, at level 3, the apprentice is not expected to run a board meeting or anything like that, but they could be planning and running meetings to discuss their project, for instance. It could be about meeting their assessor, for instance. It could be about arranging regular team meetings or organising team events, for example. So there is potential or scope out there to organise specific meetings, teams, events, etc. Logistics is something that I get asked about an awful lot, and this is really about thinking outside the box. A lot of apprentices are often puzzled by, but they need to logistics, but they need to understand that term really and what they have to do to provide the appropriate evidence to meet the criteria, both at pass and distinction. Now, the definition of logistics refers to the process of managing how resources are acquired, stored, and arrive at their final destination. Now, there's nothing to say what those resources are, so we can consider examples such as travel, accommodation. It could be stock control, it could be the planning of events, meetings again, car parking, COVID arrangements, COVID layouts of office, etc. So we need to think outside the box here of what logistics is. And of course, at distinction level, we're looking for responses with breadth and depth in order to achieve that distinction. So again, the word proactive is key, but the apprentice needs to be able to give excellent examples here to meet that criteria. And once again, this unit here is divided between the two assessment methods. So the project really will necessitate careful planning to ensure results are achieved and may well be about improving processes or saving money. If in the course of their project they show that they've managed meetings and resources, these may not be questioned further in that portfolio-based interview. Essentially, the IEPAs don't have enough time for the learner to be duplicating answers, so that is again one benefit. Another area which can be evidenced in either of the assessment methods is stakeholders. So the pass is pretty straightforward, evidenced naturally, but it directly relates to the distinction criterion of going beyond expectations. For example, say making a cup of tea for a stakeholder, for instance, for a visitor, is not above and beyond. You'd expect the the apprentice to offer a visitor refreshments of any sort. That's very much past criteria, isn't it? Not necessarily distinction. So they must do far more than just the day-to-day role in order to achieve distinction. So the first distinction then for understanding and following the principles of stakeholder management, it's really, apprentices really struggle. So only currently a few apprentices manage to evidence it. So in these two assessment methods, understanding is not really enough. There has to be evidence of applying these principles. So for example, when managing their stakeholders, how was communication differentiated between the different stakeholders? What was the reason behind it? Why? So as this is a topic that may have to be explored in more detail, we expect it to be covered in the portfolio-based interview as well. So personal qualities, it can often be assessed holistically, which is the benefit again, but apprentices need to think about how they demonstrate these traits. If asked, can they think of an explicit example of how they have shown integrity, for instance? And for the distinction criteria, it's back to the proactivity I was talking about, the proactive side of things I was talking about earlier. How have they successfully encouraged others to show these qualities, for instance? Now, these three areas are potential reasons for failure. If learners fail, it's generally because of one of these three bullet points. So, and they're all tested in the portfolio-based interview as well. So something to be aware of, because this means you can actually address it before anything gets submitted. So apprentices must be able to discuss at least 2 relevant laws or regulations, because again, it's plural. Internal policies, so plural again, external environmental factors, and then talk about how they can apply that to their own job role and organisation. Essentially, it's not enough just to say GDPR, for instance, must be adhered to. It must be relevant to the job. How is it relevant to the learner's job, for instance? It might be that, for instance, the learners quote the manual handling policy that applies on the factory floor, for instance, but they will then need to comment how they need to be trained, for instance, and they need to stick to that policy should they go on the shop floor, sorry, the factory floor or something like that. Or, for instance, you know, looking at external environmental factors, the company aim of reducing carbon emissions. Yes, it's a factor, but how does it impact the organisation? How does it affect the job role of the learner, for instance? So linking it back to their job role, contextualising what it is that they're discussing. So, in conclusion then, there shouldn't really be any surprises then. All the grading criteria set in the EPA pack. How these criteria divided up can be found on the mapping document. The apprentice needs to understand what's expected of them at the various levels. And of course, the employers need to understand what's expected of them in order for that job role to allow themselves to meet the KSBs. And of course, centres need to make sure that these things happen. And often that's a case maybe of where the business development teams come involved. Are they aware of the job role, the criteria, when they're having these talks with the potential employees? Right, hopefully now I'm going to be able to bring Laura in, who is our Digital Solutions Manager, who's just going to show you where the resources are.
Can you hear me all right, Dom?
On EPA Pro. So I'm going to try now and give Laura, bear with me, presenter rights so she can share her screen.
Fabulous. Can you hear me okay?
Panelist, Laura, you do seem to have, I can see your screen now. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can't hear you, Laura, just yet.
Right, okay. Can you hear me now?
Can you hear me, Laura? We can't hear you just yet, unfortunately. It does look as if you're not on. You are not on mute, so I don't see what the problem is.
Yeah.
Technology is a wonderful thing. Okay, Laura, if you can hear me, do you want to open up EPA Pro and I will talk through what it is? Okay, you can hear Laura. Thanks, Duncan. Appreciate it. I'll be quiet.
Thank you. about it taking so long for me to get on as well. So hopefully you can all see my screen now, and I've got EPA Pro in the background. So apologies for the late arrival to today's session. So as Dom said, I just want to show you some of those support materials that Dom's been mentioning throughout the webinar this afternoon about where you can find them. So obviously once you're onto the platform, and just to highlight, if you're maybe new and you've maybe not gone through on the platform previously, you can get in touch with myself. And I'm sure Dom will share my details afterwards, and I can give you full training on the platform as well, so that you can manoeuvre around everything okay. But what you want to do is come down to the left-hand menu and come down to the support materials here. And within here, if we go to the View tab, just underneath support materials, you'll be able to see you get two categories. So you've got your categories tab and you get your standards tab there. So if we select standard, any standards that you're approved for within your centre will then appear here. So we can see that we've got two versions on here at the moment. So I've got the Business Admin version 1, which is the 947312. Just under here, if I open all this up, you'll be able to see all of the documents showing all the support materials for this particular standard then. Okay, so there's a variety in here, and I'm going to show you some of the key things that Dom wants us to highlight as part of the session today. But just to go below that then, we've also got the 947322. And again, if I just scroll down on here, you can see all of these different resources from the Endpoint Assessment Pack Dom's been mentioning, recording forms. So we're going to show you some of these that are on here now. Now, if you are working across both versions, you will see both sets of materials within here. If you are only working on version 2, what we've done is we've popped across some materials from the version 1 that are not available yet for version 2 in their own right, but we've popped across some from version 1 for you, just so you can still use those more for sort of like standardisation and practice within the centre, and one of those being the Epa reports that we do. So you'll see that it's for the version, just here, I'll just highlight it on here. You'll see for its version 1 of the Business Admin course, but we popped it in there because still some of those principles really apply to your version 2. You know, and as soon as the activities have been completed for the version 2 endpoint assessments, we'll eventually be updating it with a brand new Epa report at some point, likely to be in 2022. Okay, so some of the things that Dom wanted me to highlight on here then with you today are some of the materials, and we're first starting to look up at the EPA overview. So I'm just going to show you, I've already pre-opened all the documents, knowing that technology is not my favourite friend this afternoon. So I've just got them all open ready for you, and just to give you a bit of an overview then. So we've got our overview sheet. So it tells you what to expect in terms of this endpoint assessment for your business administrator for version 2. So just scrolling down here, just to give you a brief overview so you know what the document looks like. We've got details about the endpoint assessment. We've got keys to some useful documents in here as well. How you can prepare for the practical elements of the endpoint assessment process. And then you've got the breakdown into your 3 areas. So you've got a little bit of guidance thinking about how does your apprentice need to prepare for this event to take place. Again, how does your training provider need to prepare in order for the endpoint assessment to take place. And then finally, for the employer, just some guidance again for you to start thinking about as a centre in order to get ready. The next document we wanted to highlight today then was the Endpoint Assessment Pack. Now, Dom's just been highlighting within his slides previously about some of these coloured elements that are on here. Now, this Endpoint Assessment pack is 69 pages long. It's got lots of information in there for you that'll give you lots of guidance in terms of preparing your apprentices for their endpoint assessment to take place and the criteria that they're aiming to showcase at the end. But just in here, just to sort of show you where Dom's got all that information in terms of the matrix element that he was showing you, and the variation between the apprentice being able to achieve a pass or a distinction for each of their KSB elements. So you'll see from the end of this document, from page 56 onwards, and I won't go into too much detail because I know that Dom's just gone through all this. It's got everything that he's just been running through with you there, so you can see the full breakdown of all the material that has just gone through. The next one we wanted to highlight then, moving along from that one, was some of the exemplar materials that we've got on the platform on EPA Pro that you can download. So this is Portfolio Overview, and in here again it just gives you an overview for your assessors to have a look through, to then sort of get that understanding, share that with the apprentices in terms of what that portfolio is going to look like. And there's some really good guidance in here. As Dom would have been saying throughout his webinar this afternoon, in terms of portfolio evidence, we're always looking at that quality over that quantity within here. Some examples of types of evidence that the portfolio might contain. Again, some really useful links to be able to go back and review the requirements for the endpoint assessment taking place in terms of the portfolio. And then right at the end, I think a really useful document. It gives you a good example of what perhaps a content sheet would look like for the portfolio being produced. So it just gives you an idea of how you'd maybe pop that all together in there as well. Moving on, the next one we wanted to show you this afternoon then is the project process guidance. So this one we're looking at is particularly for the apprentice, but again, it just gives you that lovely breakdown of, for them, what's going to happen on the day, how the IEPA is going to introduce themselves to them, what they need to think about before they start the presentation, what will happen as a result after the presentation, so again, what they can expect. And then what happens again in terms of grading as well, so that they're fully prepared. Nothing's going to come as a surprise for any of these apprentices, and that's what we want to make sure. And then finally on here, we've got the examples of the pass versus distinction criteria, so that can really sort of make that judgment as to where their answers, where their examples are sort of sitting within that grading criteria there. Okay. So that was the project, so it was the portfolio project, and there's also knowledge test guidance on here as well. So I'm just going to bring this one up. So the knowledge test guidance sheet takes you through, again, preparation for that knowledge, and I'm just going to scroll down past the contents, past the introduction stage, just onto page 4. And what it does, it'll give you each of your topical areas and what's going to be sort of covered in terms of those topics that are likely to come up within that exam. So that again gives you as a centre a really good opportunity to be able to have a look at your curriculum plans, ensure that all elements have been covered so that the apprentice is fully aware of each of the topical areas that are coming up and what's likely to be covered in each of them here. Okay, and this document just goes all the way through each of those areas there. And then the final document we wanted to make you aware of, that again you'll access from that EPA Pro site, and we do recommend, please do go on there and check them regularly as well, because if we're making any updates to any of these documents, they're going to go live onto that EPA Pro site. You can see a date when it was last updated on there as well, to be able to see if you're using the newest version. So here we've got the endpoint assessment recording forms, and if I just scroll down and scroll down past this page, our introduction, lots of blank pages on here. We've got our introduction, how you're going to be using these forms, so why you should be completing any of these forms that we've provided on here. So we've got the portfolio evidence reference declaration that should be signed up. We've then got the portfolio evidence reference form, so you can see you're referencing in here your evidence type, your evidence reference, and then the last box there is what our IEPAs will be using when they're looking at each of the elements for the portfolio. Okay, covering all of those KSBs in there, and then just coming down. We then got our project improvement declaration, so your signature form for your project. And then you've also got the breakdown for your project improvement, covering the scope, the planning, the management of it, the communication, monitoring and reporting results, and then finally the reflection in there as well. Okay, and as I said, I'm just going to come back to my other screen here, EPA Pro. You can see all of the documents that you're going to require for this particular standard within your support materials. And just over to the right of them here, you can just see the last time that they were updated and the date and the timestamp for those as well. So again, please do get in touch if you'd like to go through the EPA Pro platform and find out where each of those are. Okay, I'm going to pass back now over to you, Dom, in case there's also anything else you'd like to add in. But bear with me.
Okay, I'm guessing now that that Laura might have done. I'm sorry, Laura, I just couldn't hear you at all there, so my apologies if you're not, and I am talking over the top of you. Okay, many thanks, Laura. That's much appreciated. What I want to do now is just address the couple of questions that we have got. That little pause there has just allowed me to have a look at the couple of questions. So there is one from Tracy Durant. Hi, Tracy. Tracy said, just to clarify, can they use any of the evidence they create undertaking the project in the portfolio? Yes, they can use the project evidence in the portfolio if it maps across to the portfolio case Bs. There's no point duplicating. There's no point reinventing the wheel. So yeah, by all means, use it if it fits and only if it fits. Gordon has said it's good to get feedback after the endpoint assessment from the apprentice and identify what types of questions were asked, as these can be banked for a useful revision prep document. Yeah, absolutely. Valid point, that, Gordon. And then bear with me, the last question that we've got. Do we only submit the portfolio evidence initially and wait for the question before we upload the project? Okay, so the portfolio doesn't need to be, the portfolio-based interview case Bs doesn't need to be submitted until 2 weeks prior to endpoint assessment. At Gateway, the only thing that you submit is the 2,000 to 5,000 word report around the project. And off the back of that, that's what the question is generated off. There are also a few more questions just come in. How much earlier, so Helen said, how much earlier does the online test have to be completed before the second stage? That's entirely up to you, Helen. The earliest time you can do it is after you've gone through Gateway anyway. There's then a 5-day lead time before you can sit it, just to make sure that you've successfully gone through Gateway, you've successfully been on, the apprentice has successfully been on program for 366 days. But if I were you, I would, once you've got confirmation of successfully going through Gateway, then I would be booking the the knowledge test for as soon as possible, just to get it done and dusted, really, and out of the way, so it's one less thing to worry about. Now, bear with me, I saw a couple more come through. So Leslie, hi Leslie. Leslie says, does 2,000 to 5,000 words include images? It's essentially down to a word count, really. So if you're putting images in there as well, Leslie, that's fine. It won't make any difference. It's not page related, it's word count related. So that's absolutely fine. So there's an awful lot of people here saying we can hear Laura and Dom, but Dom clearly can't hear Laura. My apologies. I was clearly talking over the top of Laura. Okay, so if there's any more further questions that do come in, what I'll do is I'll generate an FAQ document and post it up onto our website. Just a reminder then that the customer service number has changed recently. It's now a local Wakefield number, 01924, which should be then, meaning it's free if you're using, say, your mobile phone and it's part of your contract package, for instance. Obviously, my details are on there as well, dominic.green@City and Guilds. If you've got any queries, email me directly. more than happy to help. The next step webinar is actually this webinar. So my apologies, I forgot to delete that bit out of the previous slide deck that I've adapted. And if you're unsure about when things are coming up, please feel free to go onto the website cityandguilds.com and scroll to the bottom of any of the web pages themselves and sign up to our email updates. That means then you can choose a sector you're interested in, whether it's business, customer service, operational delivery, etc. And you will then get notifications of when regional networks, webinars like this, etc., T-levels, for instance, whenever there's support meetings, webinars, when they are organised, you can register and sign up for them via that email update. We also post on there any updates that we find from IFATES, for instance. So anybody doing customer service practitioner, customer service specialist, which also sits under my business skills sector, will know, or will hopefully know then, that IFATE have extended the witness testimony dispensation over the observation until June 2022. And it's things like that that we post up on the email update. So there will be an email update regarding that coming shortly into your inbox if you run customer service as well. Okay, finally, a massive thank you to Laura. Apologies again about the sound issues, and a big thank you to everybody who's attended today. We look forward to working with you in the future. Please do reach out to us if you do have any further questions. Thanks again, and have a good week.